but it's really being operationalized by our opponents who don't want to meet us in a hard power contest and instead are trying to utilize the seams, the gray areas, and compete with us at levels below conflict. And that's really where CA, and this is the big part of our paper, can come in and really make a difference in identifying where sharp power is being executed and also finding where its vulnerable populations on key strategic areas might be, as well as coming out with our utilizing all elements of national power and a smart power methodology to counter it.
Hi, this is John McElligott, your host for today's episode on the 1CA podcast. We're joined today by three captains, authors of the paper Civil Affairs as a Function of Smart Power, Redefining Assessments, Reporting, Education, and the Role of Civil Affairs Within the Evolving Paradigm of Great Power Competition. The three captains are Kevin Chapla, who is an active component U.S. Army Civil Affairs officer. He has deployment experience in Africa, Indo-Pacific, and he's currently assigned to Bravo Company 83rd Civil Affairs Battalion, which is based in Fort Bragg, North Carolina. Captain Promotable, James Micciche, who is an active component Army Civil Affairs officer with deployment and service experience in the Arabian Peninsula, Africa, Afghanistan, Europe, and Indo-Pacific. He is currently a master's candidate at the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy at Tufts University in Boston, Massachusetts, or Boston, Ma. And Captain Kyle Staron, who's currently a planner at the 353 KCOM and a master's candidate in international security policy at the School of International and Public Affairs at Columbia University in New York City. He previously served with the 83rd CA Battalion at Fort Bragg, and he is deployed to Bahrain and Niger as a civil affairs officer. Gentlemen, thank you very much for being on the 1CA podcast.
Thank you for having us.
We mentioned before recording here that we got one of you in Fort Bragg, one in Boston, and one in New York. So I have not yet asked if we got any Red Sox fans or Yankees fans or where you guys hail from. James, where's your hometown? Where'd you grow up?
Charlottesville, Virginia. So neither a Red Sox or a Yankees fan here.
So we're not going to offend anyone either way. Kevin, how about you?
Yeah, so I actually grew up in northeastern Pennsylvania, and if you ever see The Office, I grew up right outside of Scranton, Pennsylvania. So not much of a baseball fan, but do support the Mets, and that's kind of disappointing persistently.
Yeah. Is there any town in Pennsylvania that resembles The Office, the actual town?
Yeah, so that's actually a real place.
Okay.
The Steamtown Mall exists.
Nice. All right. And Kyle, where are you coming from?
Originally from Memphis, Tennessee, so I have no loyalty to the Yankees or the Red Sox. I sympathize with the Mets just because I find them sympathetic.
Or pathetic, maybe.
Either way.
I think they have the best jingle of all time. I don't think any other baseball team has their own jingle.
Right. No, that's a good one. Well, gentlemen, we're here today to talk about your paper that you guys put together and the methodology you used, what kind of findings you had. And let me start with the first question. You talk about civil affairs as a function of smart power. So what does smart power mean to you? And this is a question I'll throw out to anyone. You could say, who's responding or not at all. Just let us know how you define smart power. What does that mean?
Yeah, I'll take that one up front. This is James. If you look at smart power is coined by Joseph Nye, who is a political scientist of international relations. And it's a combination of hard and soft power together. So what it is, it's using all the elements of national power, whether it's political, economic, military, law enforcement, even cultural power, to achieve national goals, not having an overemphasis on hard power or overemphasis on soft power, but having the correct balance to pinpoint where, when, and how we can best support our national objectives with a combination of all elements of national power.
Okay. So you guys all came from civil affairs based at Fort Bragg, the center of the universe and the home of a lot of CA tactical units. So it sounds like what you're talking about is more at the strategic level. Are you generally arguing that civil affairs should be brought up from tactical operational to more operational strategic levels?
Hey, this is Kyle. We're not arguing for any massive structural change. I think it's more of a reformatting of the outlook. So to get back to what James was talking about, tying in elements of national power into a cohesive strategy going forward, even a tactical unit can inform tactical combat commanders in terms of how to use other elements of national power at a tactical level. So I think that's what we're talking about, is just getting after how to tie in military units with initiatives put forward by the embassy in that country and vice versa, telling the embassy what the military has to offer in terms of capabilities to achieve strategic ends, even at a tactical level.
So why would you say that using civil affairs as a function of smart power is needed, or why is that a wise move for the U.S. government?
Hey, Kevin here. I'll take that one. So I think it's important to emphasize that civil affairs were often working in areas that are continuously being contested by a lot of different actors on the interstate scale, meaning that puts us in a real good position to kind of identify and determine how these peers are using their, in this case, sharp power to disrupt our efforts abroad, or trying to exploit a population, or maybe trying to destabilize an environment. So really puts us in a good position. I think that allows us to inform policymakers, or inform the DoD to then inform policymakers to identify exactly which tools need to be used, why, and where, and for what end.
So Kevin, you brought up a new term for the audience here, sharp power. You mentioned sharp power in the paper. We started off mentioning smart power. So what's sharp power all about, and who wields sharp power?
Within the context of our paper, I'll let James follow up with this because this is pretty near and dear to his heart. But within the context of our paper, in this case, peer competitors like China, Russia are those wielding sharp power. And the National Endowment of Democracy defined it as enabling authoritarians to cut razor-like into the fabric of a society, stoking and amplifying existing division. So in this case, it could take the form of China expanding its Belt and Road Initiative across Africa or through Pakistan, using their infrastructure bank to exploit local economies on the continent of Africa for that matter. But I'll let James kind of follow up with the details on that one.
Yeah, this is James. So yeah, sharp power, it's a pretty new concept that's out there, but I think it's something that we've seen in a while. So I think the previous incarnation was known as soft balancing. And what sharp power really comes from is the fact that U.S. and our allies still remain the largest power brokers in terms of hard power around the world. So even though our competitors are starting to make some small incremental, or actually not small, but some rather large incremental gains at hard power levels we still remain, and with our allies and alliances, the predominant hard power in the entire world. And furthermore to that point is, and if you look at this as well, it's the economic interdependency between the U.S. and our competitors is so much ingrained after such a large period of high globalization following the 80s and all through the 90s and early 2000s that an actual armed conflict would be very detrimental to all parties. So we have these system-level deterrences in place. And if you look at Joint Doctrine Note 1-19, so this is actually in doctrine, we are in a part of something called a competition continuum. And of those three legs of the competition continuum, one of them is competing at levels below conflict. And that's really where sharp power comes in. So what it is, it's manipulative, it's precise, it finds areas where there's instability that you can use micro-level inputs to get macro-strategic-level gains. And this is being wielded by China. One can look at their three warfares, the strategic psychological operations they utilize, the overt and covert media manipulation, and the exploitation of natural and international legal systems. Also, the Gerasimov doctrine by the Russians. And you can also look at some of the regional actors out there as well. So Iran's use of the militias throughout the Shia Crescent, it really highlights this as well. So this is something that is out there. It's still being studied and manifested, but it's really being operationalized by our opponents who don't want to meet us in a hard power contest and instead are trying to utilize the seams, the gray areas, and compete with us at levels below conflict. And that's really where CA, and this is the big part of our paper, can come in and really make a difference in identifying where sharp power is being executed and also finding where its vulnerable populations on key strategic areas might be, as well as coming out with our utilizing all elements of national power and a smart power methodology to counter it.
A good point. Now, the definition of sharp power reference, I believe, authoritarian regimes, but sounds like it's not just relegated to authoritarian governments to wield sharp power. As your argument is part that the U.S. should be doing this as well, right?
I would take a step back and say sharp power has negative connotations to it, specifically with trying to tear down democracies, tear down governance to make strategic ends met. So if you look at what Chris Krebs said, he's the director of the Cybersecurity Center for Homeland Security. He says, Russia's not trying to win the game, so to say. They're just trying to cause instability. They're trying to cause chaos, and they're trying to destabilize. So smart power is about stabilization. It's about governance. It's about building stable systems. Now, sharp power, inversely, is about tearing those down.
Right.
So you really have two diametrically opposed constructs that we can see forward here.
Okay. But I think the 95th, for example, is focusing on some governance and anti-governance capabilities. So would anti-governance, for example, if we were in a country where we wanted to help tear down the government or institutions to build up ones that were sided with the U.S. interests, then that could be seen as sharp power as opposed to smart power, or is it really just based on your perspective?
Yes, I think the resistance, counter-resistance narrative, or the offensive or defensive resistance, as I've heard it also called as well, that can kind of be filled into sharp power. But the thing is, sharp power is mostly aimed at either unocracies or democracies, so we have to look at the kind of the situation, state in which it's going on.
All right. Gentlemen, you argue that the U.S.'s most dangerous rivals will utilize non-military means to compete. So maybe talk about some evidence that supports that claim, what's been happening in the news that we could talk about that's unclassed, and what are the global conditions that you would assume for this world of less military conflict with U.S. rivals?
Yeah, this is Kyle. So James talked about the three warfares of China doctrine. That came out in 1999, so we're already 20 years behind that doctrine. And what they argued in that paper in 1999 was just a confluence of military and economic means to achieve national goals. And we're seeing that most clearly in how they're executing the Belt and Road Initiative across really the world, across Asia, into Africa, into southeastern Europe even. And not only are they achieving infrastructure development that they control and then directly benefits national Chinese companies, but also if a country cannot repay certain debts, the Chinese government itself gains complete legal control of key infrastructure such as ports and harbors.
Wow. So they really get them over a barrel.
Competing at a conflict below, or a level below conflict in such a way that they actually gain key nodes in the globalized economy, physically. We saw in Russia and Crimea, you use an irredentist claims to assume protection over a population of another sovereign country. In this case, they were saying that the ethnic Russians of Crimea deserved Russian protection, and so they were able to annex a portion of another country, again, below the level of conflict.
Kyle, one thing, I think a perfect example of what you're talking about is in Sri Lanka, where the Chinese they won a contract to build a naval facility on the coast in Sri Lanka, and part of the conditions there were, if the Sri Lankans default on this debt, then this actual port becomes Chinese property, and voila, right there and then they have access to a naval base now in Sri Lanka.
I like this, James. I'd like to add on as well. The Russians are now starting to expand not only in the Middle East, as we've seen with the news out of Syria, but look what the Sisi and Putin just had a summit last week in terms of Russia's policy in Africa. And now you see Russians providing private military contracts to large energy resources in Mozambique. And you also see them taking a more active role as a moderator and mediator between some disputes throughout Africa. Now, Africa, and China also has large inroads in Africa as well, as the other two gentlemen discussed, is going to be the world's largest economic market by 2050. So this just goes to show you how important competing for these key nodes really are at levels below conflict.
Yeah. So competing mainly through economic means, I guess, social engineering maybe, using social media and the sharp power that you described so that rivals can compete with the United States without going to armed conflict. Is there also the conditions, I guess, for this future or the ongoing situation that we have right now, I guess, with these rivals? Are they not investing in their own militaries? Are they putting money essentially into foreign economies and foreign direct investment and not so much into building arms, or are they doing both?
This is Kyle. I think it depends on each country. China and Russia are clearly in different economic conditions. So China has the money to both expand influence through the Belt and Road Initiative economically while also conducting a massive military modernization. They planned this since at least the 1980s. They were going to focus on economic modernization and then achieve a certain level of wealth and then perform military modernization, which they're doing right now.
Yeah.
On the flip side, Russia does not have the money to do anything economically. It fielded a tank that it can't actually sustain in the field. So its hard power modernization efforts are not, there's just no money behind it. Whereas their information campaigns are great. They're brilliantly executed and completely coordinated. And they have to do that because I don't think they can afford to do anything on the order of a Belt and Road Initiative, even in its local sphere of influence.
Right. So that's the cheaper way to compete, and they partner with countries like China who have the hardware.
Exactly.
And I would like to add, too, is, Russia also is Europe's gas station. I think some people don't realize that as well, is, they have that economic interdependency with one of our key allies. Many of our NATO allies get in the realms of 70-80% of their energy. And Russia's energy production is only going to expand as the Arctic starts to thaw, in a sense. I mean, right now they're currently taking liquid natural gas shipments from the Arctic, and they're taking the western route. Now they're able to go west around and deliver liquid natural gas to Korea, Japan, and China. So Russia's economic prosperity could increase in the near term, but right now we have to realize is there's an economic interdependency link between Russia and some of our major allies, both NATO and Indo-Pacific allies as well. So while Russia does have not as high of a military, they do actually have some economic interdependency factor. Well, they can't wield that at this time, as Kyle suggested.
Folks, you've been listening to an interview with Captains Kevin Chapla, James Micciche, and Captain Kyle Staron. They are authors of the paper Civil Affairs as a Function of Smart Power. When we come back, we're going to dive into their methodology for the study they conducted, their major findings, and recommendations. We'll be right back.
Let me tell you about the Civil Affairs Association, the main sponsor of the 1CA podcast. It was established in 1947. The Civil Affairs Association is a veterans organization serving professionals of the U.S. civil affairs community. Members have served or are currently serving in the armed forces or are the descendants of those who served. As a tax-exempt organization, the association operates within the guidelines of Internal Revenue Code Section 501c19. It is organized for educational, professional, fraternal, and social purposes. The association promotes esprit de corps and disseminates relevant information. The CA Association also serves as an advocate for civil affairs within DoD to ensure an adequate capability to perform any mission assigned or task to the CA community. Membership costs are low. E1 through E4 pay only $5 a year. E5 through E9 pay $20. Cadets and midshipmen pay $10, and officers and civilian pay $25 a year. Life membership is also low, pegged now at $200. So if you're committed to the CA community, then it makes a lot of sense to invest in a life membership and save in the long term.
Hi, and welcome back to the 1CA podcast. I'm your host, John McElligott. Our guests today are Captains Kevin Chapla, James Micciche, and Kyle Staron. Gentlemen, I want to ask you a question about the survey that you conducted. Could you describe the methodology? How'd you do this?
Well, as we started looking at, this paradigm that we're in and the role that CA could play as this connector of the elements of smart power, specifically linking up the interagency and the DoD and vice versa, as well as being able to understand and assess where malign actors were engaging, we wanted to make sure that the civil affairs officers had the tools and training they needed to actually fulfill this role. So the three of us have all, we've actually all served together, and we always complain about storyboards, and we jokingly said, we put more effort into storyboards than anything else in actual reporting. And that was kind of the genesis of this whole paper. And so we went off and contacted proponency, And Proponency, the artist formerly known as Proponency, gave us permission to survey the active captains and reserve captains. We chose to do a survey in which we looked at a couple different factors. Up front, we had the demographics. Then after that, we looked at what civil affairs officers, specifically captains, were reporting, and at what frequency they were reporting, and who they were reporting to, as well as which mediums they were reporting to. Then we had a third section, I think is the most important section. That was we used a 5-point Likert scale to rate the emphasis both forward and rear commands put on the various reports that they did. And finally, we had a section on education in which we asked civil affairs officers, once again on a 5-point Likert scale, to rate themselves in their ability and their knowledge of certain very important tasks that we felt were needed to A, combat sharp power, and B, promote smart power. And those were things like knowing about baseline economics, social network analysis, DoD authorities and funding, and interagency funding and authorities are some examples. We sent it out. It was open for 2 weeks. We had over 100 respondents, of which 86 had deployment experience or operational experience. So we had almost a 24% response rate between the active componency, which is a fantastic sample size, to actually get some real-time statistics and data off.
Nice. I'm going to go back to that first approach of proponency. Were they surprised when you approached them? And do you know if anyone else in recent history has ever surveyed CA officers this way?
So it's funny you should ask that. They were open to it. Luckily, a good friend of ours is up at Proponency and Personnel Division, and our former Battalion XO was up there as well. So they were very welcoming once we told them why we were surveying and what would be used for. But as there was an infamous captain survey of 2-3 years ago, we wanted to make sure that there wasn't a repeat of that. So the agreement we kind of made with them was to ensure that all of the questions were data point only, and there was no free text. And also, we promised not to leak it to, Army WTF moments like some of our predecessors might have done.
Good call.
At Symposium, we got to meet some of the civilian leads from the Marine Corps side of the house, and I'm really hoping that some of the conversations that were generated at the CA Symposium and their interest in our findings and data will eventually lead to us also being able to send the survey and get further data for the Marine side of the house as well, because we forget sometimes that they are pretty larger amount of guys and girls that are also in the CA realm. Right.
Well, yeah, and that reminds me we should mention to the audience that this was submitted as an issue paper to the Civil Affairs Association for consideration during the Civil Affairs Symposium hosted in Tampa, Florida. And your team was selected as one of the finalists, and so you went down there to present. Could you talk about that experience?
Yeah, I'll speak to that. This is Kevin here. That's one of the first times that I've actually had an opportunity to engage some of the senior leaders from both USACAPOC as well as the Civil Affairs Association. Quite honestly, before we had submitted this paper, I didn't even really know what the Civil Affairs Association was. I didn't know what it did. So on a personal level, it was really informative. It also allowed me to meet a lot of folks who had some really good perspective on civil affairs and how it fits into foreign policy, for that matter.
That's good to hear. Would you recommend other people listening that they should consider submitting an issue paper? Was it painful or was it pretty painless?
I guess things like these are kind of enjoyable when it's content that you're interested in. I think I can speak for the three of us when I say stuff like this is motivating for us, and we actually enjoy it. Which I don't know what that says about us, but. It made the process a little bit more fun. But I was actually just telling a colleague today about the association and kind of the impact it made on me in just 2 days being down there. And I think one thing we did note is demographically there's a little bit of a gap that you didn't see as many younger junior officers there. And I think that's something that we probably need to fix if we're going to move this branch into the future. So I'm excited.
Yeah, I agree. So, gentlemen, what were your major findings from the survey?
This is Kyle. I think the major finding was that reporting requirements that the civil affairs units push their teams to make are not in a format or not important information for other agencies in DoD or the U.S. government. So our reporting isn't being shared widely across different agencies, and it's not informing decision-making. In effect, we've required reporting formats that don't do anything to serve the interests of the United States as a whole. Our reporting's not informing decision-making, and as a result, the regiment doesn't have as much influence as it ought to.
Okay. Can you sort of read into that as they're just going through the motions and submitting reports that go nowhere and that no one really cares about?
Well, yeah. I mean, in a way, yeah. A lot of them are reporting back to their units, their home station units, and that reporting just stays at the home station unit. Or the reporting that's required by their forward commanders or the embassy or anyone on deployment is vastly different from the reporting format required by their home station units. So we had a lot of people report that they were double reporting. You know, you have the same information, but it's in, you know, your home station unit wants it one way, and your forward commander that you're actually supporting in the field wants it a different way. So it was little minute things like that, but for the most part, it was just the lack of quantitative analysis meant that civil affairs reporting was not taking into account for the operational cycle of forward commanders.
It reminds me of Office Space and the characters who just moan about the TPS reports, the cover sheets. And
I think what we're saying is storyboards or TPS reports. I think that's really the crux of this whole argument.
I think I want to rename the paper Storyboards to TPS reports.
Yeah, people would get it. I mean, it's bad enough that you have to do the TPS reports and cover sheets, but if you had to do it in multiple different varieties for different audiences, it's great that you've done this survey. It's putting numbers to something that I think people have talked about behind the scenes anyway.
This is James again. I would add also, Kyle, I 100% agree with everything Kyle said, but I think the largest takeaway for me, when I was a battalion sim chief, so this is just kind of how you frame things as, you know, where you sit is where you stand in terms of, you know, bureaucracy models. I would say that I think the biggest problem that I saw was that, and this is something I think a lot of us know already, is we don't have an accurate assessment tool in the civil affairs toolkit, either doctrinally or actually in terms of training and education. And I think that became pretty evident. And, you know, we did a really big doctrine review, and we asked folks specifically, are you using the CAT-F, the Conflict Assessment Framework 2.0, CAF 2.0, CAF 2.0, and only 24 folks within the whole entire survey actually used it. And of those 24 that used it, only 12 forward commands actually utilized the findings. The same thing was resident with JSIM forms, as well as other doctrinally appropriate running estimates, the ASCO Committee crosswalk. We kept on finding that these doctrinally and schoolhouse correct assessment frameworks were not being utilized. So I think when we delved further into that and actually read these, we found that these are for the nation state level. And in this paradigm we're in, we need to be able to assess populations and the effects on populations at the micro level. And we don't have a standardized tool within civil affairs to do that right now. And it's putting the DOD as the primary engagement arm with the civilian population in the human domain at a huge disadvantage by having a tool that only assesses subjective information at the nation-state level.
Well, based on what you found then, gentlemen, what are your recommendations for civil affairs to become more relevant in smart power?
Hey, Kevin here. I'll kick off this portion. At least for me, in terms of what we identified with the survey, it became very apparent very quickly that our reporting is sort of created and developed to just support organically civil affairs. Like it's something that we use only for ourselves as opposed to, all right, if we say we really want to affect some sort of strategic level end state, maybe we should take a look at reporting and try and cater that to what other folks in the interagency might find interesting and or actually useful. We've all seen it in our experience in civil affairs. That's one skill that we lack tremendously is the ability to write effectively. It's not something that's really an emphasis during the CIQC. And if you don't have it before you get through the pipeline, then you're probably not going to develop those skills during your training or further on while you're working within civil affairs. So for me, that was one of my biggest critiques, was just our ability to effectively write, and not only write just for the civil affairs community, but write in a way that is digestible for policymakers and decision makers across the whole spectrum of the U.S. government enterprise.
Right.
One of the things we talked about in the paper also was expanding the scope of the civil affairs qualification course to include more interagency schooling, sending people to D.C. to take part in some state of warrant courses or other agency courses just to get them exposure to the way the rest of the foreign policy apparatus thinks and writes and communicates. We believe that's just a huge lack of our training and education. Insofar as, exactly like James was talking about, the elements of smart power, you've got to be able to think in terms of economics and politics and culture. Is that really what we're getting out of the CAQC currently?
Anything else about training or personnel that you would recommend changing?
This is James. I think it's quintessential for the regiment on the joint level to establish common framework for assessments, and it needs to be utilized across the complete spectrum of operations. And we also need to realize that civil affairs aren't the sole gatherer of civil information. So I think as we are in this age of lethality, we can still come up with like a 3 questions or at least pertinent information that can be taken in during a major combat operations, and then have a framework that is more civil affairs focused across the entire spectrum of operations, as well as utilize surveys and other forms of data gathering to be able to really fill these metrics and have a baseline assessment to know when, where, and how adversaries are engaging with the human domain, and then also knowing what areas that are vulnerable in which with populations that are associated or reside within key terrestrial domain, whether that be narrow seas or strategic resources or anything along the likes that are of our national interest. So I think that's really paramount in establishing that.
In the paper, we bring up 2 or 3 different systems that would analyze instability versus stability in a local area. And it's just basically a questionnaire that civil affairs could use, or even conventional forces if they were in an area long enough. And what that would do is quantitatively describe the local situation and provide the same metric for every rotation going through that area. So another key component is that civil affairs teams rotate through the same geographic area, the same local area, and they don't talk with a common language even amongst the teams that are rotating in and out. Whereas with a couple of these metrics, we could measure something, the next team could continue to measure the exact same way, and you could see which way stability or instability was trending and communicate that upward.
Establishing a baseline and measuring something is paramount, as you say, to knowing whether you're making any progress and which way you're heading, positive or negative. Well, gentlemen, we'll leave it there. Ladies and gentlemen, you've been listening to an interview on the 1CA podcast with Captains Kevin Chapla, James Micciche, and Kyle Staron. They are authors of Civil Affairs as a Function of Smart Power, Redefining Assessments, Reporting Education, and the Role of Civil Affairs Within the Evolving Paradigm of Great Power Competition. Gentlemen, I thank you very much for your time. Thanks for being on the 1CA podcast.
Thanks, John, for having us.
Thanks for having us. It's a pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you for spending some time with us. Please subscribe and come back for another installment of 1CA. Until then, be safe and secure the victory.